In the heart of Maple Valley, a sleepy suburban town nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, there lived a man known to everyone simply as Mr. Mike. His yellow school bus, meticulously maintained and always gleaming in the morning sun, was a familiar sight on the winding roads that connected the scattered homes to the local schools. But what the troublemakers who decided to target his bus that fateful afternoon didn't know was that behind Mr. Mike's gentle smile and calm demeanor lay a history that would make most men tremble. 20 years as a Green Beret combat medic, with skills that went far beyond bandaging wounds and saving lives. The familiar sound of children's laughter echoed through the bus as Mike Harrison guided the large vehicle along his usual route. His weathered hands rested easily on the steering wheel, his eyes constantly scanning the road ahead through the large windshield. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the asphalt, and the autumn breeze carried the scent of pine through the open windows. To anyone watching, he was just another school bus driver, middle-aged with silver threading through his dark hair and laugh lines etched around his eyes. The kids on his route adored him. He knew each of their names, their stories, their troubles, and their triumphs. When little Sarah missed her stop because she fell asleep, Mike made sure she got home safely. When Tommy struggled with anxiety about riding the bus, Mike's calm presence and gentle encouragement helped him overcome his fears. He was more than just their driver. He was their protector, their friend, and sometimes their confidant. The bus itself was Mike's pride and joy. Every morning, he arrived at the depot early to inspect every inch of his vehicle, checking the tires, testing the lights, and ensuring everything was in perfect working order. His attention to detail might have seemed excessive to some, but to Mike, it was second nature. Years of military service had ingrained in him the importance of preparation and maintenance. Lives had depended on his thoroughness before, and as far as he was concerned, they still did. The other drivers at the depot often joked about his meticulousness, calling him the inspector behind his back, though always with good-natured respect. "Mike's at it again," they'd say, watching him circle his bus with practiced precision, checking for landmines. But Mike would just smile, continuing his routine with the same unwavering focus he'd maintained throughout his career in special forces. The town of Maple Valley itself was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, where Friday night football games were community events, and where the local diner served the same menu it had for the past 30 years. It was exactly the kind of peaceful existence Mike had sought after leaving the service. The chaos and intensity of his former life seemed a world away from the quiet streets and friendly faces of his adopted hometown. Most mornings, Mike would stop at Clara's cafe before starting his route, picking up his usual black coffee and exchanging pleasantries with Clara herself, a widow who had run the place single-handedly since her husband passed. "The usual, Mike?" she'd ask, already reaching for his favorite mug. "You're as predictable as the sunrise." She had no idea that the man who sat at her counter each morning, quietly sipping his coffee, had once navigated through war zones, saving countless lives while dodging bullets and evading enemy fire. The town's children had their own theories about Mr. Mike. Some said he was a superhero in disguise, others insisted he must have been a race car driver in his younger days, given how smoothly he handled the bus on the winding mountain roads. None of them could have guessed the truth, that their beloved bus driver had been a member of one of the most elite military units in the world, or that the steady hands that guided them safely to school each day had performed emergency surgery under heavy fire. As Mike pulled up to another stop, watching another group of children climb aboard with their oversized backpacks and endless energy, he felt the same sense of purpose that had driven him throughout his military career. Different uniform, different mission, but the core remained the same, protecting those in his care, ensuring their safety, being ready for whatever challenges might arise. The late afternoon sun painted the mountains in shades of gold and purple. As Mike began his final route of the day, the bus was quieter now, with only a handful of students from the after-school programs heading home. He could see them in his rearview mirror, Katie working on her math homework, James listening to music through his headphones, and Peter staring dreamily out the window. It was the kind of peaceful moment he had come to cherish, so different from the high-stakes intensity of his former life. Little did Mike know that this ordinary afternoon was about to take an extraordinary turn. The skills he had hoped to leave behind, the training he had tucked away with his uniform, would soon be called upon once again. But for now, he continued. His route, the big yellow bus moving steadily through the quiet streets of Maple Valley, carrying its precious cargo toward home. Long before Mike Harrison became known as the friendly school bus driver of Maple Valley, he had earned a different kind of respect in the unforgiving theaters of war. His journey through the Special Forces had shaped him in ways that the peaceful residents of his adopted hometown could never fully comprehend. The Green Berets hadn't just been his unit. They had been his family, his crucible, and his proving ground. The memories of his service remained vivid, carefully compartmentalized, but never truly forgotten. He could still feel the weight of his medical kit, packed with supplies that could mean the difference between life and death in the field. The rhythmic sound of helicopter rotors, the distinctive crack of gunfire, and the urgent calls for a medic were etched into his consciousness, a soundtrack to 20 years of service that had defined his life. Mike had been more than just a medic. He had been a warrior healer, trained not only to save lives, but to take them if necessary. The Green Berets had taught him to move like a shadow, to read situations with tactical precision, and to make split-second decisions that could alter the course of a mission. His hands, now gentle as they guided the school bus through suburban streets, had once moved with lightning speed to stem bleeding, extract bullets, and stabilize the wounded. All while under enemy fire, there had been countless missions, each one testing his resolve and skills in different ways, like the time in Afghanistan when his unit had been ambushed in a remote valley. Mike had worked tirelessly for hours, treating wounded teammates while simultaneously helping to coordinate their defense. His ability to remain calm under pressure, to think clearly when chaos erupted around him, had saved multiple lives that day. The training had been brutal, designed to push human endurance to its absolute limits. Mike had learned to operate with surgical precision in conditions that would break most people. He had mastered the art of combat medicine, becoming equally proficient with a rifle as he was with a scalpel. The Green Berets had molded him into someone who could heal or harm, protect or destroy, all in service of his mission and his team. But it wasn't just the physical training that had shaped him. The psychological aspects of his role had left an equally profound mark. He had learned to read people, to sense tension before it erupted into violence, to anticipate threats before they fully materialized. These skills, honed in combat zones across the globe, had become second nature, as natural as breathing. One particular mission stood out in his memory, a covert operation in South America that had gone sideways. The team had been tasked with extracting a high-value target, but poor intelligence had led them into a trap. Mike had found himself performing emergency surgery on a teammate in the back of a moving vehicle, using nothing but basic supplies, and his training to keep his friend alive. The precision required, the focus needed to block out the chaos around him. It had been a defining moment in his career. The decision to leave the service hadn't been easy. After 2 decades of living, on the edge of being the person others relied on in their darkest moments, the transition to civilian life had seemed daunting. But the toll of war, the weight of the lives lost despite his best efforts, had begun to wear on him. He had seen enough death, enough suffering. It was time for a change. Maple Valley had offered him something he hadn't even known he was looking for peace. The simple act of driving a school bus, of being responsible for children's safety in such an ordinary way, had provided a different kind of purpose. He still served, still protected, but now his battleground was the quiet streets of a small town, and his charges were children with bright futures ahead of them. His medical skills hadn't completely gone to waste in civilian life. There had been minor incidents, scraped knees, bee stings, the occasional nosebleed, where his expertise had come in handy. The parents and teachers appreciated having someone with medical training behind the wheel, though they assumed his knowledge came from basic first aid courses. None of them knew about the combat situations where he had performed life-saving procedures under fire, or the advanced medical training that had prepared him for the worst scenarios imaginable. The Green Beret motto, De oppresso liber, to free the oppressed, still resonated with Mike, though its application had shifted dramatically. Now, instead of liberating villages from insurgents or extracting wounded soldiers from combat zones, he focused on ensuring the safety and well-being of the next generation. Every child who stepped onto his bus was under his protection, and he took that responsibility as seriously as any military mission. His apartment, a modest one-bedroom space above the local hardware store, contained few reminders of his previous life. His medals and commendations were carefully stored away in a locked trunk, along with photos of his unit and the memories they represented. The only visible sign of his military service was a small Green Beret pin he kept on his bedside table, a personal reminder of who he had been and the skills he carried with him. Mike had found that the discipline and attention to detail required in Special Forces translated well to his new role. The same focus he had once used to scan for threats in hostile territory now helped him monitor his surroundings and ensure his young passengers' safety. The situational awareness that had kept him alive in combat zones now helped him navigate busy school zones and anticipate potential traffic hazards. The tranquil routine of Maple Valley began to shift one crisp autumn afternoon, when the first rumbles of trouble echoed through the quiet streets. The sound started as a distant growl, growing steadily louder until it became impossible to ignore. The unmistakable roar of multiple motorcycles approaching in formation. The Wild Wolves, a motorcycle gang known for causing trouble in neighboring towns, had decided to make their presence known in the peaceful community. Their arrival sent ripples of unease through the town. Mothers hurried their children inside. Shop owners watched nervously from their windows, and the usual friendly chatter on Main Street died down to worried whispers. The gang's reputation preceded them. They weren't just weekend riders out for a cruise. The Wild Wolves had a history of vandalism, intimidation, and violence that had made headlines in several counties. The gang's leader, a hulking figure known as Razor, cut an imposing figure as he led his pack through town. His custom chopper, gleaming with chrome and adorned with wolf imagery, announced his arrival with a thunderous growl that seemed to shake the very windows of the shops lining Main Street. Behind him, a dozen riders followed in tight formation, their leather jackets bearing the snarling wolf emblem that had become synonymous with trouble. Mike Harrison observed their arrival from the driver's seat of his parked school bus, his trained eyes taking in every detail. He was waiting outside Maple Valley Middle School for the afternoon pickup, but his attention was fully focused on the new arrival. He noticed how the gang moved with practiced coordination, their formation suggesting military-style organization. These weren't random troublemakers. They operated with purpose and discipline, making them all the more dangerous. The gang members spread through town like a dark tide, some breaking off to circle the neighborhoods, while others congregated outside Clara's Cafe. Their presence transformed the usually peaceful afternoon into something tense and uncertain. Mike watched as they conducted what he recognized as reconnaissance. scanning buildings, noting security cameras, identifying potential targets. It was the same kind of systematic assessment he had performed countless times in combat zones, only now he was watching it used for far less noble purposes. Clara's normally busy cafe had nearly emptied as the bikers gathered outside. Through the large windows, Mike could see Clara herself, trying to maintain her usual cheerful demeanor as she served coffee to the unwelcome customers, her hands trembling slightly as she poured. The other patrons had quickly finished their meals and departed, leaving only a few brave regulars who refused to be intimidated. Sheriff Thompson's patrol car cruised past slowly, and Mike could see the concern on the officer's face. In a town this size, the local law enforcement wasn't equipped to handle a gang of this size and organization. They could call for backup from the county, but response times were slow, and a lot could happen in the meantime. As Mike continued his observations, he noticed something else that raised red flags in his mind. The gang members weren't just marking businesses, they were paying particular attention to the school grounds and the buses in the parking lot. Their gazes lingered too long on the security cameras, the access points, the schedule posted on the school's main entrance. They were planning something, and whatever it was, it involved the school. The afternoon bell rang, and students began streaming out of the building. Mike shifted his focus to his immediate responsibility, ensuring the safety of his passengers. As the children boarded his bus, he noticed how some of them eyed the bikers nervously, their usual boisterous chatter subdued. He offered reassuring smiles, maintaining a calm demeanor that helped settle their nerves, all while keeping one eye on the gang members who had paused to watch the departure process. "Everything okay, Mr. Mike?" asked Tommy, one of his regular riders, glancing anxiously at the bikers. "Those guys look scary." "Nothing to worry about, Tommy," Mike replied with a confidence that helped ease the boy's concerns. "Just some visitors passing through." But even as he spoke the words, he was noting how Razor and his lieutenants were exchanging meaningful looks, their body language suggesting they were formulating plans. Throughout the afternoon route, Mike noticed motorcycles appearing periodically in his mirrors, keeping pace with the bus from a distance. They were being watched, studied. His military training kicked in automatically. He began varying his route slightly, taking different turns, making it harder for anyone to predict his patterns. The changes were subtle enough not to alarm the children or draw attention, but significant enough to make surveillance more difficult. The gang's presence continued to cast a shadow over Maple Valley as the day wore on. By evening, they had established themselves at the local motel on the outskirts of town, their motorcycles lined up outside like dark sentinels. The town's usual evening activities were subdued. The park was empty, the ice cream shop closed early, and families hurried through their errands with unusual haste. Mike completed his final route of the day with extra vigilance, ensuring each child made it safely inside their home before moving on to the next stop. As he parked the bus in the depot for the night, he performed his usual inspection with even more attention to detail, checking for any signs of tampering or surveillance devices. His instincts, honed through years of combat experience, told him that the wild wolves weren't just passing through. They were setting up for something bigger, and somehow the school buses figured into their plans. The next morning dawned, grey and cool, with a heavy mist clinging to the streets of Maple Valley. Mike arrived at the bus depot earlier than usual, while stars still dotted the pre-dawn sky. Something about the wild wolves' behavior the previous day had triggered his tactical instincts, and he wasn't about to take any chances with his passengers' safety. As he approached his bus, his eyes methodically scanned the surroundings, taking in details that others might miss. The depot was quiet at this hour, with only the distant sound of the highway breaking the silence. Mike began his usual inspection routine, but today it was different. This wasn't just his regular safety check. This was a security sweep, the kind he'd performed countless times in combat zones. His practiced hands moved over the bus's exterior, checking for signs of tampering. He tested the door mechanisms, inspected the engine compartment, and examined every inch of the undercarriage. As he worked, his mind processed everything around him with military precision. The placement of the other buses, the shadows cast by the security lights, the blind spots in the depot's camera coverage, everything was catalogued and analyzed. He noticed fresh tire tracks in the gravel near the fence, too wide for the typical vehicles that accessed the depot. Motorcycle tracks. They had been here during the night. Moving inside the bus, Mike's inspection became even more thorough. He checked every seat, every storage compartment, looking for anything out of place. His fingers traced along the edges of panels, feeling for signs of tampering. The medical kit he kept hidden under his seat, more comprehensive than the standard. First aid kit required by the school district was exactly as he'd left it, but something still felt off. The radio crackled to life as other drivers began arriving for their morning routes. Mike acknowledged their cheerful greetings with his usual friendly demeanor, but his attention never wavered from his task. He had learned in special forces that maintaining normalcy while conducting surveillance was crucial. Don't let them know you're watching. Don't let them know you're ready. Through the bus windows, he observed the Wild Wolves scouts riding past. The depot, their motorcycles deliberately quieted. They were doing their own morning reconnaissance, likely planning their next move. Mike recognized their pattern. He'd seen similar tactics used by insurgent groups. The gang was methodically gathering intelligence, establishing routines, identifying vulnerabilities. His fellow drivers noticed the bikers too, but their concerns were more straightforward. "Bunch of troublemakers," muttered Frank, an older driver who'd been with the district for 20 years. "Should call the sheriff on them." Mike listened, but said little, his mind working through scenarios and contingencies. The sheriff's department was already stretched thin, and the gang knew it. They were counting on the limited law enforcement resources. As he completed his inspection, Mike made mental notes of potential defensive positions around the depot and along his route. His military training had taught him to always have multiple exit strategies, to identify choke points and vulnerable areas. Now he applied those same principles to his bus route, mentally marking safe zones and potential hazards. The morning, mist began to lift as the first students arrived at their stops. Mike greeted each one with his usual warmth, but his vigilance never wavered. He watched the streets, the intersections, the parked vehicles along his route. The gang members were still out there, their motorcycles appearing periodically in his mirrors, maintaining their surveillance. During a brief stop at Clara's cafe, Mike positioned himself at the counter where he could observe both the street and the reflection in the large plate glass window. Clara looked tired, her usual cheerful demeanor strained. "Those bikers were in here late last night," she confided quietly as she poured his coffee. "They were asking questions about the school, about the bus routes." Mike nodded, filing away this information. "Any specific questions?" he asked casually, noting a motorcycle passing by for the third time in 10 minutes. They wanted to know about schedules, which buses carry the most kids, that sort of thing. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she spoke. "I didn't tell them anything but Mike. I'm worried. They didn't seem like people who take no for an answer," he reassured her with a gentle smile. But his mind was already processing this new information. The gang's interest in the bus routes confirmed his suspicions. They were planning something significant, something that involved the school transportation system. But what? Robbery seemed too simple for this level of reconnaissance. No, they were after something bigger. Throughout the morning route, Mike maintained his heightened awareness while keeping his students calm and unaware of any potential danger. He caught glimpses of gang members at various points along his route, their presence becoming more obvious. As the day progressed, They were getting bolder, less concerned about being seen. That usually meant they were close to making their move. During his midday break, Mike took a different route back to the depot, using the opportunity to gather his own intelligence. He noted which gang members were stationed where, their patterns of movement, their methods of communication. His trained eye picked up details that others might miss. The subtle hand signals between riders, the strategic positioning of their surveillance points, the way they monitored police movements. The weight of his hidden past pressed against his consciousness. For 3 years, he had managed to keep his special forces background separate from his quiet life as a school bus driver. But now, as he watched the wild wolves tightening their net around the town, he knew that separation might soon come to an end. The skills he had hoped to leave behind might be the only thing standing between these criminals and whatever harm they intended to bring to his community. The first confrontation came during the early afternoon route. Mike was dropping off students at Maple Valley Elementary when he noticed 3 motorcycles parked near the school's main entrance. Razor himself leaned against his bike, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the sidewalk. 2 of his lieutenants flanked him, a lean, scarred man known as Switch and a muscular enforcer they called Brick. The tension in the air was palpable as Mike brought his bus to a stop. The children inside had gone quiet, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Through his mirror, he could see their wide-eyed stares fixed on the intimidating figures outside. Mike's hand rested casually on the door control, but his body was coiled with readiness, every muscle prepared to respond to any threat. "Stay seated, everyone," Mike said calmly, his voice carrying the same soothing tone he'd used countless times to reassure wounded soldiers in the field. "We'll wait here a moment." His eyes never left the bikers as they sauntered toward the bus, their boots scraping against the pavement with deliberate slowness. Razor approached first, his leather jacket creaking as he moved. The wolf emblem on his back seemed to snarl in the afternoon light, its silver threads catching the sun. He stopped just short of the bus door, looking up at Mike with a predatory smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Nice bus you got here," Razor called out, his voice carrying easily through the open driver's window. "Real nice, clean, well-maintained." He ran a gloved hand along the yellow exterior, his rings leaving slight scratches in the paint. "Be a shame if something happened to it." Mike met his gaze steadily, his expression neutral but alert. Years of combat experience had taught him to read people, to sense their intentions before they acted. Razor was testing him, looking for signs of fear or weakness. "Can I help you with something?" Mike asked, his tone professional but firm. Switch laughed, a harsh sound that made some of the children flinch. "Maybe you can, old man. Maybe you can tell us about your route, where you pick up, where you drop off. Useful information for concerned citizens like ourselves." "I'm afraid that's confidential information," Mike replied, his hand still resting on the door control. "School district policy." His other hand had already pressed the silent alarm button under his dashboard, though he knew help would take time to arrive. Brick took a step forward, his massive frame blocking more of the afternoon sun. "Policy," he sneered. "We don't care much for policy. We make our own rules." His hand moved to his belt, where the outline of something heavy was visible. Beneath his jacket, Mike's training kicked in automatically, his mind calculating distances, angles, potential weapons within reach. The tire iron under his seat, the fire extinguisher mounted on the wall, the heavy flashlight in his emergency kit. But he remained, still, knowing that escalating the situation with children present wasn't an option. "Listen carefully," Razor said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper that only Mike could hear. "We're going to be making some changes around here. Your bus, your route, they're going to be useful to us. You can either help us willingly or—" He left the threat hanging, his implication clear. Inside the bus, Tommy had started crying softly, his fear breaking the tense silence. The sound seemed to please the bikers, their grins widening as they noticed the children's distress. Mike felt a familiar surge of protective anger, the same feeling he'd experienced countless times when civilians were threatened in war zones. "I think it's time for you to leave," Mike said quietly, but with an authority that made Razor's smile falter slightly. "These children need to get home, and you're blocking a school zone." Razor's eyes narrowed, searching Mike's face for any sign of fear. Finding none, his expression darkened. "You're not hearing me, old man. This isn't a request. We're taking over these routes, one way or another. Tomorrow morning you're going to take a different path, one we choose. And you're not going to say a word about it to anyone." Mike's response was measured, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had faced far worse threats. "No, you're not hearing me. These children are under my protection. Whatever you're planning, it's not happening on my bus." The tension crackled between them, a silent battle of wills. Razor's hand twitched toward his jacket, but Mike's steady gaze never wavered. For a moment, the hardened gang leader seemed unsettled by the calm determination in the bus driver's eyes. A police siren wailed in the distance, growing closer. Razor's lieutenants shifted uneasily, looking to their leader for direction. After a long moment, Razor stepped back, his forced smile returning. "We'll talk again real soon," he promised, his tone heavy with threat. "Real soon." The bikers mounted their motorcycles, the engines roaring to life with unnecessary force. As they pulled away, Razor turned back for one final look at Mike, his expression promising future confrontations. The children watched through the windows as the gang disappeared around the corner, their relief palpable in the sudden quiet. Mike waited until the motorcycles were completely out of sight before releasing a slow breath. He turned to his passengers, his voice gentle but firm. "Everyone okay?" A chorus of shaky yes responses answered him. He knew this was only the beginning. The gang would be back, and next time they wouldn't be so easily deterred. The next morning dawned cold and grey, heavy clouds hanging low over Maple Valley like an ominous warning. Mike arrived at the bus depot well before sunrise, his senses heightened after yesterday's confrontation. The encounter with Razor and his gang had confirmed what his instincts had been telling him. They weren't just planning simple vandalism. This was something bigger, more organized, and the school buses were somehow key to their operation. As Mike approached his bus in the dim light, he immediately noticed something was wrong. The security lights that usually illuminated the depot were dark, and there was an unnatural stillness in the air. His hand instinctively moved to the small flashlight on his belt, a habit from his military days, as he carefully approached his vehicle. The beam of light revealed what he had feared. Someone had been tampering with his bus overnight. The driver's side door showed subtle signs of forced entry, barely noticeable to an untrained eye. Mike's jaw tightened as he conducted a swift but thorough exterior check. No obvious explosives or major damage, but that almost made it more concerning. The wild wolves had been careful, methodical. Inside the bus, everything appeared normal at first glance, but Mike's trained eye caught the small details, the slight displacement of his seat, the nearly imperceptible scuff marks on the floor, the faint smell of unfamiliar cigarette smoke lingering in the air. They had been thorough in their search, but what were they looking for? Or worse, what had they planted? A sudden movement in his peripheral vision caused Mike to freeze. Through the bus windows, he caught a glimpse of shadows, moving between vehicles in the depot. Not just one or two. He counted at least 5 distinct figures. The gang hadn't just invaded his bus, they were surrounding him. "Come on out, bus driver," Razor's voice cut through the pre-dawn silence. "We need to have that talk I promised." Mike remained still, his mind racing through options. The depot's office was too far. He'd never make it without being seen. His phone was in his pocket, but calling for help now would take too long. Whatever was about to happen would be over before the police could arrive. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," Razor continued, his voice closer now. "We just want to make a deal. You help us, we help you. Simple as that." Mike's hand moved to the hidden compartment under his seat, where he kept his advanced medical kit. Behind the bandages and medications was something else, something he'd hoped never to need: a small tactical knife, a reminder of his past life. He'd kept it not out of paranoia, but because 2 decades of military service had taught him to always be prepared. "Last chance to do this the easy way," Razor called out. The sound of boots on gravel indicated the gang was closing in. After that, well, accidents happen, even to careful bus drivers. Mike took a deep breath, centering himself the way he had done countless times before combat operations. The familiar calm of battle focus settled over him as he made his decision. He couldn't let them take control of the bus, not when he knew it would put children at risk. "All right," Mike called back, his voice steady. "Let's talk." He moved to the bus door, every sense alert, noting the positions of each gang member he could see. Switch and Brick were to his left, partially hidden behind another bus. 2 more members he didn't recognize were by the depot fence. And Razor was directly in front of his bus, his massive frame silhouetted against the growing dawn. As Mike stepped down from the bus, he maintained an appearance of cautious resignation. Let them think they had him cornered. Let them think he was just another civilian, intimidated by their show of force. 20 years in Special Forces had taught him the value of being underestimated. "Smart choice," Razor smiled, but the expression was cold, calculated. "Now here's how this is going to work. You're going to take a little detour on your morning route. Pick up the kids like normal, but instead of taking them to school, you're going to drive them somewhere else. We've got some business to handle, and those kids are our insurance policy." Mike's blood ran cold as the full scope of their plan became clear. They weren't just planning to hijack his bus. They were planning to use innocent children as hostages. Every protective instinct in his body, honed through years of combat medicine and Special Forces operations, screamed in opposition. "Think carefully about what you're doing," Mike said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that made several gang members shift uneasily. "Whatever you're planning, involving children crosses a line you can't uncross." Razor's face darkened. "You don't seem to understand your position here, old man. This isn't a negotiation." He reached into his jacket, pulling out a switchblade that glinted in the dim light. "You're going to do exactly what we tell you, or you're not going to be driving anything ever again." The tension in the air was palpable as Mike stood his ground, his mind calculating angles and distances, marking positions and potential weapons. The familiar surge of adrenaline began to flow through his veins, but his exterior remained calm. Years of combat experience had taught him to channel that energy, to use it rather than be controlled by it. The moment stretched taut as a tripwire as Mike made his final assessment. He had hoped to avoid violence, to find a peaceful resolution. But these men had made their choice when they decided to threaten children. Now he would make his. The pre-dawn darkness erupted into sudden, violent motion. Razor lunged forward with his switchblade, expecting to find an easy target in the seemingly harmless bus driver. Instead, his blade sliced through empty air as Mike moved with a speed and precision that shocked everyone present. In one fluid motion, Mike stepped inside Razor's attack, his hand shooting out to grip the gang leader's wrist with crushing force. Before anyone could react, Mike had already executed a perfect arm lock, using Razor's own momentum against him. The switchblade clattered to the ground as the gang leader's arm bent at an unnatural angle, forcing him to his knees. The move was executed with the smooth efficiency of someone who had performed it countless times in far more dangerous situations. "What the hell?" Switch snarled, reaching for his own weapon. But Mike was already moving, keeping Razor's larger frame between himself and the other gang members. His movements were economical, precise, nothing like the clumsy defense they'd expected from a school bus driver. "Boss!" Brick shouted, starting forward, but he froze when Mike applied slightly more pressure to Razor's arm, causing the gang leader to grunt in pain. The other gang members hesitated, suddenly unsure of how to handle this unexpected development. "Listen carefully," Mike said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge of authority. "I'm going to explain something to you, and you're going to pay attention." The years of commanding special forces units rang through his tone, stopping the advancing gang members in their tracks. Razor struggled against the hold, but Mike's grip was like iron. Each attempt to break free only resulted in more pressure on his twisted arm. "You're dead," Razor spat, though the fear in his voice betrayed his bravado. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." "No," Mike replied quietly, "you have no idea what you're dealing with." In one swift movement, he shifted his grip, using a pressure point technique that made Razor gasp in pain. 20 years as a Green Beret combat medic, I know exactly how the human body works, how to heal it and how to hurt it. The revelation hung in the air, changing the atmosphere completely. The gang members exchanged uncertain glances, finally registering that the man they'd dismissed as an easy target was something else entirely. They were no longer facing a simple bus driver. They were facing a highly trained military operative. Switch made a sudden move, pulling a gun from his jacket. Before he could aim, Mike had already reacted. He released Razor with a push that sent him stumbling into Switch, disrupting his aim. In the same motion, Mike closed the distance between them, his hands moving with surgical precision to disarm Switch before anyone could blink. The gun spun through the air, landing far from reach. Switch found himself on the ground, his arm locked behind his back, wondering how he'd gotten there so quickly. Mike's movements were a blur of practiced efficiency, each action flowing smoothly into the next. Brick charged forward, his massive frame barreling toward Mike like a freight train. But size meant little against skill and experience. Mike pivoted, using Brick's own momentum to send him crashing into a nearby bus. The impact echoed through the depot, followed by the sound of Brick sliding to the ground, dazed and disoriented. The remaining gang members started to back away, their confidence shattered by the sudden turn of events. They had expected an easy intimidation job, not a confrontation with a combat veteran who could take them apart without breaking a sweat. "Here's what's going to happen," Mike announced, his voice carrying across the depot. "You're going to leave. Not just this depot, but this town. If I see any of you near my bus or these children again, what happened here will seem like a pleasant memory." To emphasize his point, Mike moved with lightning speed, disarming another gang member who had been reaching for a weapon. The knife went flying, and its owner found himself face down on the gravel, arm twisted painfully behind his back. The move was executed with such precision that it looked almost effortless. "I've dealt with insurgents, terrorists, and warlords," Mike continued, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. "People who actually knew how to fight, who had something real to fight for. You're nothing but bullies who prey on the weak. That stops now." Razor had regained his feet, clutching his injured arm. The fear in his eyes was now mixed with fury and humiliation. "This isn't over," he growled, but he was already backing away. "Nobody does this to the wild wolves." "It is over," Mike replied simply. "You just don't know it yet." His stance shifted slightly, and even that small movement made several gang members flinch. "I've spent years patching up wounds in combat zones. That means I know exactly where to put them too. Think about that before you decide to come back." The gang members who were still standing helped their fallen comrades to their feet. They retreated to their motorcycles, keeping their eyes on Mike as if expecting him to attack at any moment. But he remained still, his presence radiating a contained lethality that was more intimidating than any overt threat. As the sound of motorcycles faded into the distance, Mike allowed himself to relax slightly. He knew this wasn't truly over. Men like Razor didn't give up easily, but he had sent a clear message, and more importantly, he had protected his charges. The children who rode his bus would remain safe, even if it meant he had to draw on skills he'd hoped to leave behind. The rising sun began to paint the sky in shades of pink and gold as Mike returned to his bus inspection. His movements were, once again, those of a careful, methodical bus driver, but now there was no hiding the military precision in his actions. The secret was out, and with it, a new chapter in his life had begun. The aftermath of the confrontation unfolded rapidly as the morning sun climbed higher in the sky. Sheriff Thompson's patrol car came screaming into the depot, lights flashing, followed closely by 2 deputy vehicles. They had responded to the silent alarm Mike had triggered during the initial confrontation, but arrived only to find the situation already resolved. "What in God's name happened here?" Sheriff Thompson demanded, taking in the scene. Scattered, weapons on the ground, drops of blood on the gravel, and the unmistakable signs of a serious altercation. His eyes settled on Mike, who was calmly completing his morning bus inspection as if nothing unusual had occurred. "Had some uninvited visitors," Mike replied simply, closing the engine compartment. "The wild wolves decided to press their luck. They won't be bothering us again." His voice carried a quiet certainty that made the sheriff study him more closely. "Deputy." Rogers was already radioing in descriptions of the motorcycles he'd passed on his way to the depot. "They were heading east on Highway 27, looked like they were in a hurry. Want us to pursue, Sheriff?" Thompson held up his hand, his attention still fixed on Mike. "Hold on that." He stepped closer to the bus driver, lowering his voice. "Mike, I've known you for 3 years, never seen so much as a parking ticket from you. Now I've got reports of a major altercation, and you're standing here cool as can be. Want to tell me what's really going on?" Mike met the sheriff's gaze. Steadily, after a moment's consideration, he nodded toward his bus. "Let's talk inside." Once they were seated, Mike began explaining, not everything but enough. He told Thompson about his Special Forces background, his years of service, and why he'd chosen to keep it quiet. The sheriff listened intently, his expression shifting from surprise to understanding. "Well, that explains a few things," he said. "Finally, like how you handled that bus crash last winter in the snowstorm. Wasn't just first aid training, was it?" Mike shook his head. "Combat medicine, 20 years of it." He paused, then continued, "Sheriff, those men weren't here just to cause trouble. They were planning something bigger. They wanted to use my bus route, wanted to use the children as hostages for something." Thompson's face darkened. "You sure about that?" "Positive. They're too organized, too methodical for simple vandalism. Whatever they're planning, it's significant enough to risk taking children hostage." Mike's voice carried the weight of his experience. "They might have backed off for now, but they'll try again. Different approach, different target, but they'll try." The sheriff ran a hand through his graying hair, processing this information. "I'll put out alerts to neighboring counties, get some extra patrols on the school routes. But Mike, I need to... No, can you handle this if they come back?" Mike's response was immediate and certain. "Those children are under my protection, Sheriff. I've spent my life defending people who couldn't defend themselves. That doesn't change just because I'm driving a school bus now." A small smile crossed Thompson's face. "Somehow, that's not very reassuring for the wild wolves." He stood up, adjusting his gun belt. "All right, here's how we play this. Officially, there was an attempted vandalism that was thwarted by our increased security presence. Unofficially," he paused, looking at Mike significantly, "we've got ourselves a guardian angel on the morning bus route." Mike nodded, appreciating the sheriff's discretion. "I'll keep you informed if I notice anything suspicious. They're not done yet. Men like that don't handle humiliation well. No, they don't, Thompson agreed. He started to step off the bus, then turned back. You know, Mike, this town's been good to you these past few years. Gave you the peace you were looking for after your service. Now it looks like it's time to return the favor. Already done, Sheriff, Mike replied quietly. This town, these kids, they're my responsibility now. The wild wolves just haven't realized yet how bad a mistake they've made. As the law enforcement vehicles departed, other bus drivers began arriving for their morning routes. They cast curious glances at Mike, having heard fragments of radio chatter about the incident. But he simply went about his routine, checking his bus, reviewing his route, preparing for the day ahead. The first students would be arriving at their stop soon, and Mike was determined to maintain their sense of normalcy and security. They wouldn't know about the confrontation that had occurred in the pre-dawn darkness, wouldn't understand the lengths their driver had gone to ensure their safety. But as Mike settled into his seat, starting the engine with its familiar rumble, he felt a familiar sense of purpose settling over him. It was the same feeling he'd had on countless missions, the quiet certainty of knowing exactly what needed to be done and having the skills to do it. The wild wolves had unknowingly awakened something in him, something he'd tried to leave behind but had never really forgotten. His bus pulled out of the depot just as the morning sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the pavement. Mike checked his mirrors, scanned his surroundings, and began his route. To anyone watching, he was just another school bus driver starting his day. But now he was also something more, a protector, a guardian, a silent sentinel ensuring the safety of his charges. The battle might have been won, but Mike knew the war wasn't over. The wild wolves would regroup, would try again. But this time, they would find more than just a school bus driver waiting for them. They would find a Green Beret who had sworn to protect the innocent and who had never broken that oath. The hours following the confrontation brought an uneasy calm to Maple Valley. Word spread quickly through the small town, though the details remained murky. Some said there had been a fight at the bus depot. Others whispered about police involvement, but no one seemed to know exactly what had happened. Through it all, Mike maintained his usual routine, picking up and dropping off students with the same quiet efficiency he had always shown. Tommy was the first to notice something different about Mr. Mike that morning. As he climbed aboard the bus, he saw faint marks on Mike's knuckles, barely visible but unmistakable to his observant young eyes. "Are you okay, Mr. Mike?" he asked, genuine concern in his voice. "Did something happen with those scary guys from yesterday?" Mike offered him a reassuring smile. "Everything's fine, Tommy. Just had to fix a few things on the bus this morning. Nothing to worry about." But even as he spoke, his eyes continued their constant scan of the surroundings, watching for any sign of the wild wolves' return. Throughout the morning route, parents at the bus stop seemed more attentive than usual, standing with their children until the bus arrived and watching until it disappeared around the corner. News of the gang's presence had made everyone more cautious, more aware of potential threats to their peaceful community. At one stop, Mrs. Anderson, a retired teacher who had lived in Maple Valley for 40 years, approached the bus door. "Mike," she said quietly, "I heard what happened this morning. My son's on the police force." She paused, then added with a knowing look, "Thank you for protecting our children." Mike nodded acknowledgement, understanding that the truth about his background would gradually become known. It was inevitable in a town this size, where news traveled faster than the morning breeze. But he wasn't concerned about his cover being blown anymore. His priority now was ensuring the safety of his passengers and the community that had given him a second chance at a peaceful life. During his midday break, Mike drove to Clara's cafe, parking the bus where he could maintain a clear view of the street. Clara herself brought his coffee to the counter, her hands steady now, her earlier fear replaced by a quiet confidence. "Heard what you did," she said softly, pouring an extra cup for herself and sitting across from him. "My nephew's girlfriend's brother works at the depot. Said you moved like nothing he'd ever seen before." Mike took a sip of his coffee, neither confirming nor denying the story, but Clara wasn't finished. "You know, when you first came to town, I wondered about you. Something in the way you carried yourself, the way you were always aware of everything around you. Guess now I know why. Just did what needed to be done," Mike replied simply, but Clara shook her head. "You did more than that. You showed those thugs that Maple Valley isn't as defenseless as they thought. That means something." She stood, patting his hand gently. "Your coffee's on the house from now on." As the afternoon progressed, Mike noticed subtle changes in how people reacted to his presence. The respect had always been there. He was responsible for their children's safety after all, but now there was something more. Recognition, perhaps, or understanding. The quiet man who had driven their children to school for 3 years was suddenly seen in a new light. At the elementary school pickup, Principal Matthews made a point of coming out to speak with him. The administrator's usual businesslike demeanor was tinged with newfound appreciation. "Mr. Harrison," he said, using Mike's surname formally, "I wanted to personally thank you for your dedication to our students' safety. The school board will be hearing about your actions today." Mike tried to deflect the attention. "Just doing my job, sir. The children's safety has always been my priority." But they both knew it was more than that now. The line between his past life and his present one had blurred, and there was no going back. As he completed his afternoon route, dropping off the last of his young passengers, Mike reflected on how quickly things had changed. The peaceful routine he had carefully built over 3 years had been disrupted, but perhaps that wasn't entirely bad. He had chosen this life, this town, these children to protect, and now he could do so more openly, more effectively. Sheriff Thompson's patrol car pulled alongside the bus at the final stop. "Any sign of them?" he asked through his open window. Mike shook his head. "Nothing yet, but they'll be back. Men like that don't give up easily." "No," Thompson agreed, "they don't. But neither do men like you." He handed Mike a card with a number written on it. "Direct line to my cell, any time, day or night." The sun was setting as Mike parked his bus in the depot for the night. The evening light cast long shadows across the ground where just hours ago he had been forced to reveal a part of himself he'd thought he'd left behind. But as he conducted his final inspection of the day, he realized that he felt lighter somehow, as if maintaining his cover had been a weight he hadn't known he was carrying. Walking home in the gathering dusk, Mike noticed a group of children playing basketball in the park. They waved to him enthusiastically, their young faces beaming with admiration. He waved back, knowing that while his secret was out, his mission remained the same, protecting those who needed protection, serving his community in the best way. He knew how. The day was ending much differently than it had begun, but Mike was at peace with the changes it had brought. The wild wolves had forced his hand, made him reveal his true nature, but in doing so, they had unknowingly strengthened his connection to the town he had chosen to call home. Assistant, the impact of Mike's confrontation with the wild wolves rippled through Maple Valley like waves on a pond, touching every corner of the small community. In the days that followed, the town underwent a subtle but significant transformation. The fear that had gripped the residents began to fade, replaced by a newfound sense of security and pride in their community. The story of the school bus driver who had stood up to a notorious gang became a source of inspiration, shared over coffee at Clara's cafe, discussed at PTA meetings, and whispered about at children's soccer games. The local newspaper, the Maple Valley Gazette, ran a carefully worded story about the incident. While it didn't reveal Mike's full military background, the article praised his dedication to the community's safety and his swift action in preventing potential harm to school property. The paper's editor, a sharp-witted woman named Janet Chen, had done her research thoroughly, but chose to maintain a level of discretion that Mike appreciated. At school, the children who rode his bus had developed a new kind of respect for Mr. Mike, gone were the occasional complaints about his strict adherence to rules or his insistence on proper behavior. Instead, they sat a little straighter, spoke a little more politely, and even helped maintain order among themselves. The younger ones had created their own fantastic versions of what had happened, their imaginations running wild with tales of their bus driver's heroics. "I heard Mr. Mike fought off 20 bad guys," Tommy whispered excitedly to his friends one morning, his eyes wide with admiration. "My dad says he's like a real-life superhero." The other children chimed in with their own theories and stories, each more elaborate than the last. Mike listened to their chatter with quiet amusement, letting them have their fun while maintaining his usual professional demeanor. He knew the importance of letting them feel secure while not glorifying the violence that had occurred. The school administration had taken additional security measures in the wake of the incident. New cameras were installed around the bus depot and school grounds, and security protocols were reviewed and updated. Principal Matthews had called a special assembly to discuss safety with the students, being careful to balance awareness with reassurance. "Remember," he had told the gathered children, "our community is strong because we look out for each other. Just like Mr. Mike looks out for you on the bus, we all have a responsibility to be aware and to report anything unusual to trusted adults." The changes weren't limited to the schools. Sheriff Thompson had increased patrols around town, coordinating with neighboring counties to monitor any wild wolves activity in the region. He made regular stops at the bus depot during Mike's morning inspections, their conversations brief, but meaningful as they shared information and observations. "They've been spotted near Miller's Creek," Thompson reported one morning, leaning against his patrol car. "Seems they've set up some kind of temporary base there, but they're keeping their distance from Maple Valley for now." Mike nodded, absorbing the information while checking his bus's brake lines. "They're regrouping, planning their next move. Men like that don't let go of a grudge easily." "No, they don't," Thompson agreed, "but they've never dealt with someone like you before either." The sheriff had done his own research into Mike's background, discovering a service record that impressed even his experienced law enforcement perspective. 20 years in special forces, multiple combat deployments, advanced medical training that went far beyond basic field medicine. Mike Harrison was far more than just a school bus driver who could handle himself in a fight. Clara's Cafe had become something of an unofficial headquarters for town discussions about the incident and its aftermath. Clara herself had noticed a change in her regular customers' behavior. They sat facing the windows more often, watching the street with greater awareness. Parents held their children's hands a little tighter, and neighbors checked on each other more frequently. "It's like the town woke up," Clara commented to Mike during one of his coffee breaks. "We all knew something like this could happen, but we never thought it would. Now everyone's paying attention, looking out for each other more." Mike understood what she meant. The wild wolves had shattered the town's sense of invulnerability, but in doing so, they had strengthened its community bonds. People were more vigilant, more connected, more aware of the need to protect what they valued. The children on Mike's bus route had developed their own way of showing support. They began leaving small gifts on his driver's seat. Handmade cards, drawings of buses surrounded by protective superheroes, and once, a carefully crafted paper medal with "World's Bravest Bus Driver" written in crooked letters. Sarah, a quiet fourth grader who had always been one of his more observant passengers, approached him one morning with a serious expression. "Mr. Mike," she said softly, "my daddy was a soldier too. He says you're the kind of person who makes the world better by being in it." These moments of connection and appreciation touched Mike deeply, though he maintained his professional demeanor. He had chosen this life this town, these children to protect, and their trust in him reinforced the rightness of that choice. The town's gratitude manifested in other ways as well. The local mechanics offered to service his personal vehicle for free. The hardware store owner insisted on giving him a discount on some home repairs he'd been planning. Even the usually gruff owner of the local diner would add extra bacon to his breakfast sandwich without charging for it. But perhaps the most significant change was in Mike himself. The weight of maintaining his cover, of keeping his past hidden, had lifted. He could now fully integrate both aspects of his life, the disciplined, highly trained Special Forces veteran and the caring, patient school bus driver. The two weren't as different as he had once thought. During his regular route, Mike maintained his heightened awareness while engaging more openly with his passengers. He began sharing small lessons from his military experience, teaching the children about responsibility, teamwork, and the importance of looking out for one another. He never discussed the violence or combat aspects of his service, instead focusing on the values and principles that had guided him. "Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared," he told them one morning, after overhearing some of the older kids discussing the incident. "It means you do what's right even when you are scared, and sometimes the bravest thing you can do is ask for help or tell someone when something's wrong." The local veterans community had also reached out to Mike, welcoming him into their fold. The VFW post commander, an older Vietnam veteran named Frank Wilson, had personally invited him to their meetings. "We take care of our own," Frank had said, "and now we know you're one of us. Plus, having a Green Beret around might class up the place a bit." As weeks passed, life in Maple Valley settled into a new normal. The bus depot had enhanced its security measures, the school district had implemented new safety protocols, and the community had developed a stronger sense of collective responsibility for its children's safety. But Mike never let his guard down. He knew the wild wolves were still out there, nursing their wounded pride and plotting their revenge. Every morning, he conducted his thorough inspection of his bus, checking for signs of tampering or surveillance. Every route, he remained alert for any unusual activity or suspicious vehicles. The town had changed, and so had he. The careful separation he had maintained between his past and present had dissolved, replaced by a more integrated sense of purpose. He was still Mike Harrison, the reliable school bus driver who knew every child's name and never missed a stop. But he was also the Green Beret who had sworn to protect the innocent and who would do whatever was necessary to keep his charges safe. The autumn sun continued to rise over Maple Valley each morning, illuminating a town that had grown stronger. Through adversity, and in the early light, a yellow school bus would begin its rounds, driven by a man who had found his true mission in life, not on distant battlefields, but on the quiet streets of a small town that had become his home. The final confrontation with the wild wolves came on a crisp October morning, just as the leaves were beginning to turn golden on the maple trees that gave the town its name. Mike had sensed it coming for days, noting subtle changes in the town's atmosphere. Small signs that most would miss, but that his years of combat experience had taught him to recognize. Unfamiliar vehicles parked in unusual locations, strange faces appearing briefly in shop windows, the sudden absence of the usual motorcycle. Scouts. The wild wolves had been planning, adapting their strategy after their initial failure. They had learned from their mistake of underestimating Mike, but they had made a new error. They had become predictable in their surveillance, following patterns that Mike easily detected. Each day, he noted their positions, their rotations, building a mental map of their operation while appearing to go about his normal routine. That morning, Mike arrived at the bus depot even earlier than usual. The sky was still dark, stars fading as the first hints of dawn crept over the horizon. His inspection of the bus was methodical, more thorough than ever, checking not just for mechanical issues but for any signs of tampering or sabotage. He found what he was looking for on the underside of the bus: fresh scratch marks near the brake lines, evidence of recent interference. Right on schedule, he muttered to himself, continuing his inspection as if he hadn't noticed anything. A miss. Through the corner of his eye, he caught movement in the shadows between the buses. They were already here, waiting, thinking they had the element of surprise. Mike allowed himself a small smile. Some habits never changed, whether you were dealing with insurgents in foreign territories or gang members in small-town America. Sheriff Thompson's patrol car pulled into the depot right on schedule, part of the increased security measures they'd implemented. Mike had informed him of his suspicions the day before, and they had prepared accordingly. The sheriff's arrival was meant to look routine, just another early morning check-in. "Morning, Mike," Thompson called out, stepping from his vehicle. "Everything okay here? Just finishing up the inspection," Mike replied casually, his voice carrying across the quiet depot. "Might need you to take a look at something, though." It was their pre-arranged signal. Trouble was indeed brewing. The sheriff nodded, understanding the message. Additional deputies were already in position around the depot's perimeter, hidden from view but ready to respond. They had learned from Mike's military experience, setting up a proper perimeter and maintaining radio silence. The trap was set, but the wild wolves didn't realize they were the ones being trapped. The first sign of action came with the sound of motorcycles approaching from multiple directions, more than before, suggesting Razor had called in reinforcements. Mike continued his inspection, appearing oblivious to the approaching threat. Let them think they had the advantage of numbers and surprise. Razor's voice cut through the pre-dawn silence. "Should have taken the deal, old man." He emerged from between two parked buses, flanked by several new faces, harder-looking men than his usual crew. "Now we do this the hard way." Mike straightened slowly, turning to face them. His posture was relaxed, but his mind was calculating distances, angles, potential weapons. He noted the positions of each gang member, the bulges in their jackets that suggested weapons, the way they spread out to surround him. At least 15 of them, more than last time, but numbers didn't necessarily mean advantage. "Last chance," Razor continued, his voice carrying an edge of forced confidence. "Step aside, let us take the bus. Nobody needs to get hurt." "You're right," Mike replied calmly. "Nobody needs to get hurt. That's why you're going to turn around and leave this town. For good this time." Razor's laugh was harsh in the morning air. "You think you can take all of us? Maybe you got lucky last time, but this is different. We came prepared." "So did I," Mike answered, his voice taking on the commanding tone he'd used countless times in combat situations. "Sheriff, now!" The depot's floodlights suddenly blazed to life, temporarily blinding the gang members who had been lurking in the shadows. In the same instant, law enforcement officers emerged from their hidden positions, weapons drawn. But the wild wolves hadn't survived this long by being easily cornered. Instead of surrendering, they charged. The depot erupted into chaos as gang members scattered, some rushing toward Mike, others trying to reach their bikes. But Mike was already moving, his actions precise and devastating. The first attacker went down with a perfectly executed joint lock, his knife clattering across the pavement. The second found himself airborne, thrown into two of his companions with calculated force. Mike moved through the melee with fluid efficiency, each motion economical and purposeful. His special forces training showed in every movement. This wasn't street fighting or barroom brawling. This was combat expertise honed through years of real-world application. He didn't waste energy on flashy moves or dramatic strikes. Each action was designed to neutralize threats quickly and effectively. Razor, seeing his plan unraveling, pulled a handgun from his jacket. But before he could aim, Mike had closed the distance between them. His disarming technique was textbook perfect: twist, strike, dislocate. The gun fell harmlessly away as Razor howled in pain, his wrist bent at an unnatural angle. The sheriff and his deputies moved in efficiently, securing suspects and calling for backup. They had trained for this scenario, following Mike's suggestions about coordinated response and containment. The wild wolves found themselves outmaneuvered and outmatched, their superior numbers meaning nothing against proper tactical planning and execution. Throughout the combat, Mike maintained perfect situational awareness, just as he had been trained. He knew where every opponent was, where each officer was positioned, and most importantly, he ensured the fight stayed away from the school buses. Property could be replaced. The children's safety was his primary concern. As the last of the gang members were being handcuffed, Razor made one final desperate attempt. Breaking free from the deputy holding him, he rushed at Mike with a hidden blade. But Mike had been expecting something like this. Men like Razor always had one last card to play. The fight was over in seconds. Mike deflected the blade, struck 3 precise points on Razor's body, and took him down with a technique that looked deceptively simple, but required years of training to master. As Razor lay gasping on the ground, Mike knelt beside him. "It's over," Mike said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "You made a mistake targeting this town, these children. Whatever you were planning, whoever you were working for, it's finished. If you or anyone associated with your gang comes near this town again, what happened today will seem like a pleasant memory." The sun was fully rising by the time the last police transport left the depot. The wild wolves were in custody, their bikes impounded, their threat to Maple Valley finally ended. Sheriff Thompson approached Mike, who was already preparing his bus for the morning route. "You knew they'd try something like this," the sheriff said. "It wasn't a question." Mike nodded, checking his mirrors. Men like that are predictable. They can't handle being beaten, especially not by someone they underestimated. They had to try again, had to prove themselves right. All we had to do was wait and be ready. "The FBI's interested in them now," Thompson added. "Seems they're wanted in connection with some bigger operations across state lines. This might have shut down more than just a local gang." Mike wasn't surprised. He had recognized some of the new faces, men he'd seen in briefings during his service, connected to larger criminal organizations. The wild wolves had been pawns in a bigger game, one that would now be disrupted thanks to their failed attempt at revenge. The first students would be arriving at their stop soon. Mike completed his inspection, erasing all signs of the morning's violence from his bus and his demeanor. The children didn't need to know about the battle that had been fought for their safety. They just needed to know that Mr. Mike would be there, as always, to drive them safely to school. As he pulled out of the depot, Mike caught a glimpse of his reflection in the rearview mirror. The quiet bus driver and the Special Forces veteran had finally merged into one person, a protector who had found his true calling not on distant battlefields, but on the peaceful streets of a small town that had become his home. The weeks following the final confrontation with the wild wolves brought a lasting peace to Maple Valley. The town, which had held its collective breath during the gang's presence, finally relaxed into a new normal. But this peace was different from before. It was stronger, more resilient, built on the knowledge that their community could face adversity and emerge stronger. Mike's morning routine remained unchanged, but there was a deeper appreciation for his dedication among the townspeople. Parents waiting at bus stops would often greet him with knowing smiles and grateful nods. The children, while still buzzing with excitement about their bus driver's heroics, had settled into a new kind of respect for Mr. Mike, one that went beyond mere awe at his revealed abilities. Clara's cafe had become something of a shrine to the events, though Mike himself would have preferred otherwise. A framed copy of the newspaper article about the gang's arrest hung on the wall, alongside a candid photo of Mike helping a young student with her heavy backpack. Clara had positioned them deliberately where Mike's usual seat at the counter faced away from them, respecting his modest nature while still honoring his contribution to the town's safety. "You know," Clara said one morning, sliding his usual coffee across the counter, "this town's changed since you came here. We just didn't realize how much until now." She paused, wiping down the counter with practiced movements. "My father was a veteran, never talked much about his service, but he had that same look you get sometimes, that way of seeing things others might miss." Mike nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "Some habits stay with you," he replied, taking a sip of his coffee. "Become part of who you are." The school administration had made permanent changes to their security protocols, many based on suggestions Mike had quietly made over the years. Principal Matthews had asked him to help train other bus drivers in basic security awareness, teaching them to spot potential threats and respond appropriately. These sessions revealed another side of Mike, the patient instructor who could break down complex security concepts into simple, practical steps. The other drivers, some of whom had initially been skeptical, came to appreciate his expertise and his practical approach to keeping their students safe. "It's not about being paranoid," he explained during one session. "It's about being prepared. Notice patterns, trust your instincts, and always have a plan." His fellow drivers found themselves adopting his habits, checking their buses more thoroughly, being more aware of their surroundings, taking their responsibility as protectors more seriously. The children on his route had developed their own traditions in the wake of the events. They had designated the seat directly behind Mike as the guardian seat, taking turns sitting there and acting as his unofficial assistant. Mike allowed this harmless game, understanding their need to feel involved in their own safety while maintaining proper bus protocol. Tommy, who had always been one of Mike's more attentive passengers, had taken to carrying a small notebook where he wrote down security observations during their daily rides. Most were innocent noticings: a new car parked on their street, a stranger walking through the neighborhood. But Mike made sure to acknowledge each report, teaching the boy the difference between being alert and being afraid. Sarah, the quiet fourth grader whose father had served in the military, began bringing small care packages for Mike. "Daddy says warriors need to keep their strength up," she explained shyly, handing him carefully wrapped homemade cookies and energy bars. Mike accepted these gifts with grave courtesy, knowing they represented more than just snacks. They were a connection between his past life and his present one. The local VFW post had made Mike an honorary member, though he rarely attended their formal meetings. Instead, he would sometimes stop by in the late afternoons, sharing quiet conversations with other veterans who understood the challenges of transitioning from military to civilian life. These men became an informal support network, helping Mike navigate his new public identity as both a veteran and a community guardian. Sheriff Thompson had incorporated some of Mike's tactical knowledge into his department's training procedures. The deputies now approached their patrols with greater awareness, using techniques Mike had taught them about scanning for threats and maintaining proper situational awareness. The town's law enforcement had become more effective, not through increased aggression, but through smarter, more strategic policing. "You've started quite a revolution here," Thompson commented one morning during his regular check-in at the bus depot. "Got my deputies thinking like special forces now. Next thing you know, they'll be wanting to jump out of planes." Mike smiled at the joke, but they both knew the serious impact his influence had had on the department. The success of the operation against the wild wolves had demonstrated the value of proper planning, coordination, and tactical awareness, even in small-town law enforcement. The FBI's investigation into the wild wolves had revealed connections to larger criminal enterprises, just as Mike had suspected. The gang's attempted takeover of Maple Valley had been part of a broader strategy to establish trafficking routes through seemingly peaceful small towns. Their defeat had disrupted these plans and led to several high-level arrests in other states. Mike's role in this larger victory remained unofficial, known only to a few federal agents who had quietly visited the town to gather intelligence. He had shared what he knew while keeping the focus on the local law enforcement's successful operation, deflecting attention from his own crucial role in the events. The town's children had perhaps been the most profoundly affected by the events. Their bus rides with Mr. Mike had become more than just transportation. They were daily lessons in courage, responsibility, and community. The older students began looking out for the younger ones, reporting anything unusual they noticed, and taking pride in their role as members of what they called Mr. Mike's Safety Patrol. One morning, as Mike helped a kindergartner adjust her oversized backpack, he overheard two parents talking nearby. "You know," one said to the other, "I used to worry about sending them on the bus. Now I can't think of anywhere they'd be safer." The other parent nodded in agreement. "It's not just that he can protect them. It's that he's teaching them to be strong, to be aware, to look out for each other. My Jeremy used to be so shy, but now he helps the younger kids find their seats, make sure everyone's following the rules." These small changes in the children's behavior were perhaps Mike's greatest contribution to the town's future. He was helping to raise a generation that understood the balance between vigilance and paranoia, between strength and aggression, between protecting oneself and helping others. As autumn deepened into winter, Maple Valley settled into its new rhythm. The story of the wild wolves became part of the town's folklore, shared with pride but tempered by the understanding that peace must never be taken for granted. Mike continued his roots, maintained his vigilance, and quietly guided his young charges toward a future where they would understand the true meaning of community and protection. The morning sun still found him conducting his detailed bus inspections, his practiced eyes missing nothing. But now, as he drove through the familiar streets of Maple Valley, he felt a deeper connection to his mission. He wasn't just a former Green Beret who had found peace driving a school bus. He was a guardian who had found his true calling, protecting not just the children in his care, but the very heart of the community he now called home.